You know that special kind of quiet that only happens after a snowstorm, where it feels like everything is muted? It gives you that feeling of being completely sealed off from the rest of the world. In some ways, it feels like a magical winter wonderland. But when the temperature begins to plummet and the wind begins to howl, it can also start to feel a little bit unsettling. Suddenly, the familiar sounds of your own home start to sound and feel alien. Every creak in the floorboard, every shadow that catches the corner of your eye, just feels a little different in that winter silence. When you're stuck inside, whether it's because it's so cold or the snow is piling up, that's when the real horror can begin. So today I want to share with you some of my absolute favorite winter horror stories. These are the stories that will drop you into isolated hotels, find you in remote towns, and put you in places where something is lurking out in the cold. They don't just use winter as a backdrop, they turn it into a weapon. They make the snow, the cold, and the isolation just as effective as any monster could ever be. Let's kick things off with the undisputed king of winter horror, shall we? No pun intended, I don't think. Stephen King's The Shining. And I know you've seen the movie, whether it's the Kubrick film or one of the made-for-TV movie adaptations, but I'm begging you, if you have never read this book, read this book. You are missing out on a totally different experience, one that I think is not only better, but far more terrifying. The setup at this point is honestly pretty iconic. An aspiring writer and recovering alcoholic, Jack Torrance, takes the job as the winter caretaker at the Overlook Hotel high in the mountains in Colorado. He brings along his wife, Wendy, and his son, Danny, hoping that the solitude will help him finish his writing project and give him an opportunity to reconnect with his family. The problem is, the Overlook Hotel has different ideas, and his son Danny has a psychic gift, which is called The Shining, that allows him to really be aware of the dark history and the dark things that are happening in the halls of this place. As a brutal winter storm snows them in, the hotel starts to prey on Jack's sanity, tapping into his worst instincts and turning him against his own family. What makes this book so scary is that you get a front row seat to the psychological degradation of Jack Torrance's mind. You're right there inside his head as the hotel whispers to him, twisting his personal frustrations and impatience into anger, hatred, and homicidal rage. I truly think King is the master at atmospheric horror. The cold isn't just outside the hotel, it seeps into the very hallways, it seeps into the characters themselves. It's a ghost story, yes, but the real horror is watching a family break down and seeing that monster inside a man claw its way out. It's the ultimate cabin fever nightmare story, and an absolutely essential read for any Stephen King fan, and I would argue for any horror fan. Alright, for our next book, picture this. A massive blizzard hits a small New England town, but it's bringing something much worse than just snow and ice. This is Snowblind, a novel by Christopher Golden. And if you've never read a Christopher Golden novel, he writes in such a way that pulls you along pretty quickly. His books read very fast, and they're never too dense, but they're always pretty captivating. Snowblind is a book that almost feels like a classic Stephen King novel, and will definitely make you deeply suspicious of the next snow day. The story is set in the small town of Coventry, Massachusetts, which was traumatized by a killer storm 12 years earlier. That storm left many people dead and many people missing, as well as quite a few mysteries. Now, as a new blizzard of epic proportions begins to barrel down onto this town, that old inevitable sense of dread returns, and for a good reason. As the storm rages, strange things start to happen. Icy figures begin to seem to dance through the air, and maybe even more unsettling, the people who were lost in the last storm start to reappear. Golden uses the blizzard to create a perfect sense of claustrophobia, and the horror really comes with this escalating dread of the unforeseen forces that reside in the storm. It turns a very familiar, almost idyllic landscape into a hunting ground. But I will say I think it's also a deeply human story, where a town is forced to reckon with its past as well as its grief and guilt. Snowblind is a horror story that blends natural disaster with the horror of something ancient and malevolent, but also sprinkled with a good dose of human guilt and grief. Perfect for a day reading under the covers. But maybe you like your stories a bit more post-apocalyptic. What happens when the world ends not with a giant explosion or an alien invasion, but with a silent, snowy fade to black? That's the terrifying question at the center of our next book, Moon of the Crusted Snow. Now, Moon of the Crusted Snow is, to me, one of the most underrated horror novels of all time. It is a book that I don't often hear people talk about, and I really think they should. And if you've never read it, I'm going to ask you, give this one a chance. This isn't your typical post-apocalyptic story. It's quiet, tense, and deeply unsettling as it uses the harsh realities of winter to explore survival, community, and cultural resilience. The story takes place in a small, remote Anishinaabe community in rural Ontario, far in the north of Canada. As winter starts to arrive, the power goes out. First the TV, then the phones, and then finally everything. At first it's just an annoyance, but as days turn into weeks, the community starts to realize they are completely cut off from everything in the outside world. Panic starts to set in as food runs low, and they have to relearn and fall back on traditional skills and knowledge to survive the winter. They finally begin to find a tenuous peace, but that peace is shattered when an outsider from the south shows up, fleeing a collapsing city and bringing a whole new danger to this community. Moon of the Crusted Snow is so effective because it feels so terrifyingly plausible. The author, whose name I'm not going to attempt because I will get it wrong, is an Anishinaabe writer, and he brings a profound sense of authenticity to the story, weaving Anishinaabe language and tradition right into the narrative. You feel the biting cold, the growing hunger, the ever-increasing sense of dread and unease, and it's not hard to put yourself in the story of a community feeling the rising tension as they face the unknown. The winter here isn't just a setting, it is an active opponent to the community, a force that tests everyone to their absolute limits. The horror comes not from monsters, but from human desperation and the breakdown of society, and the fear of what people become when they're cold, hungry, and desperate. But I also think it's a pretty powerful story of how when everything falls apart, sometimes the greatest strength can be found in community and heritage. And if you like Moon Over the Crusted Snow, I would definitely encourage you to check out the sequel book, Moon of the Turning Leaves, which I actually think is an even better book. Either way, I don't think you'll be disappointed. All right, I just want to pause just for a second because I'm sharing some of my favorite thrilling winter reads, but if you have some of your own, please put them down in the comments below because I think all of us are looking for new book recommendations, and oftentimes this is where we find our next great read. Also, if you're interested in purchasing any of these books, I've put the links down in the description below, and these are affiliate links, so I would get a little bit of a percentage from any of the sales, but this is through bookshop.org. And the reason I chose to partner with bookshop.org is because 80% of the profit margin goes to supporting local bookstores, and you can even decide which local bookstores you want that 80% margin to go to, which I think is a pretty great thing. And you can absolutely buy these books wherever you would like, but if you would like to support local bookstores with your purchase, or if you want to help the channel out a little bit, you could definitely use those links below. All right, back to the list. This next book is by far the chonkiest of any of the other books on this list. Let's talk about The Terror by Dan Simmons, a winter horror novel that should be on every person's winter horror reading list, I think. This is a monster of a book in every sense of the word. It's a massive, epic mix of historical fiction, survival horror, and supernatural dread that is absolutely unforgettable. The novel is a fictional take on Captain Sir John Franklin's real-life lost expedition to the Arctic. Two Royal Navy ships, the HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror, set out to find the Northwest Passage, but get hopelessly trapped in ice. What follows is a slow descent into frozen hell. As years pass, yes, years, not days, the crews are hit with starvation, scurvy, lead poisoning from their canned food, mutiny, and cannibalism. So there's your warning. And if that wasn't bad enough, they're being stalked across the ice by a mysterious creature that is hell-bent on destroying them and consuming them. A monstrous polar bear-like beast that seems both intelligent and just pure evil. Dan Simmons did a wild amount of research for this novel, and it shows on every page. You feel the bone-deep cold, the despair of the endless polar nights, and the gnawing, all-consuming hunger of the crew. You feel the creeping dread and the horror of the unknown and of what might happen next. The historical detail is so impressive in this novel, and also so immersive, that those natural horrors, the frostbite, the sickness, the sheer hopelessness of it all, are often more frightening than the monster that's hunting them. The book perfectly captures the psychological damage of being trapped in a place that is actively trying to kill you and consume you. The Terror is a long, a bit slow, but intentionally so, often brutal, I think, masterpiece of atmospheric horror and tension. It's a story about human fragility set against a hostile, indifferent nature, and it will leave you feeling cold long after you finish reading the book. For those willing to dive deeply into this book and give it the time that it needs, I think this will easily become one of your favorites. All right, before we get to our last book, I wanted to give a few honorable mention shout-outs. First up would be Snow by Ronald Malfi. A brutal blizzard cuts off a group of travelers in rural Iowa, but something else moves in the storm. Stranded and desperate, they discover that the snow itself hides a horrifying and human threat. This is equal parts survival thriller and equal parts supernatural horror. Snow is a chilling ride of isolation, fear, and what happens when nature turns against you. So, a good time. Terror Mountain by Jerry Griffiths. When a group of friends ventures into the remote mountains for a weekend getaway, their adventure turns into a nightmare. Something ancient and hungry lurks in the cold shadows, and as the body count rises, survival becomes the only goal. One word. I think it's one word. Bigfoot or Yeti. Abominable snowman? That's definitely 2 words. Either way, if you're looking more for a creature feature type of story for a winter read, Terror Mountain. It's a good time. And it's not a very well-known book. This was, if I'm not mistaken, self-published, so it's kind of under the radar. But it was a pretty good time. Dark Matter by Michelle Paver. Set in 1937, Dark Matter follows a young explorer joining an Arctic expedition to a desolate outpost where the sun never rises for months. As the polar night descends, eerie footsteps and whispers suggest he's not alone. This is really almost more speculative fiction than straight up horror. It's definitely got some paranormal and horror aspects to it. But I actually found this book to be pretty deeply thoughtful and even at times moving. So if you're looking for something a little bit more emotionally grounded and a little less horrific that it's going to make you unsettled, but still has some kind of supernatural aspect, Dark Matter might be the choice for you. And my last honorable mention is Let the Right One In. In a bleak Swedish suburb, 12-year-old Oscar finds an unlikely friend in Ellie, a mysterious child who only comes out at night. But Ellie harbors a dark secret. This is another story that's been made into a movie, actually a really good movie as well. It's not a secret that vampires are involved, but this story is really about loneliness and friendship and finding a place in the midst of the chaos and hurt of life. So this one actually has way more depth than a lot of kind of winter horror reads. And technically this book takes place in autumn, but it's Sweden, so it might as well be winter if you're like living anywhere further south than Sweden. But it's definitely a good read, as is the sequel book, if you've ever read that. All right, and finally my last book for you, which is actually a little different because it's a graphic novel. So if you want a winter horror read, but you don't necessarily want something super thick or with a ton of words, and maybe you want something just a little different, this might actually be perfect for you. And the book is 30 Days of Night by Steve Niles, with incredible art by Ben Templesmith. The premise is brilliantly simple. The story is set in a remote town, Barrow, Alaska, so far north that every winter, the sun sets and doesn't rise again for 30 days, hence the name 30 Days of Night. And this month of darkness is an irresistible invitation to a pack of vampires. These aren't your romantic, shiny, glittery-skinned, conflicted, gothic vampires. These are savage, merciless, cruel creatures who look as if they've just discovered an all-you-can-eat buffet. As the vampires descend, they sever all communications in the town, plunging the town into chaos and isolation. The story follows the town's sheriff and his wife as they lead a small band of survivors in a desperate battle for their lives. What makes this story so great is the raw, primal fear of being hunted in the unending darkness. The winter setting isn't just atmosphere, it's the entire foundation for the horror. The cold and the isolation weaken the senses and wear you down, while the snow-covered landscape becomes a canvas for some pretty brutal violence. Templesmith's stark, nightmarish art perfectly captures the feeling of a world plunged into a frozen hell, splashed with the deep crimson of blood. It's a brutal, fast-paced survival story that I think actually reinvigorated the vampire genre and is guaranteed to make you dread long winters. They also made a film of this one, I think it's with Josh Hartnett, and it was also pretty good. So after reading the graphic novel, watch the movie, with some warm, cozy hot cocoa to help balance things out a bit. So there you have it, a handful of books that I think will give you a chill down your spine this winter season. Once again, if you have some great winter horror reads, please put them down in the comments below, and don't forget those links if you'd like to purchase any of these books. As always, my name is Topher. Stay curious, read deeply, and I'll see you in the library.